Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited to have my friend, who is he's sort of intellectually, he's a little Batman-esque insofar as he's mild-mannered Wall Street bon vivant by day, and then obscure intellectual completist by night. I'm referring, of course, to David Bahnsen. He's the founder. I mean, like, not since Lou Gehrig got Lou Gehrig's disease has there been a bigger coincidence than David Bahnsen working at the Bahnsen Group. But he's big investor guy, longtime friend of National Review, friend of mine, and he's back. So, David, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to be back with you.
I should also say you're the author of several books, and we'll put them in the show notes and all of that. And so we're recording this Tuesday morning, a little later than normal, 10:45. And you had said that you wanted to wait to see what the markets were going to do before you started. So, and the reason normally we wouldn't be so on the news, but we're on the news because there's this whole debt ceiling brouhaha. What is your take on the whole situation? Are the markets going to freak out, or are we going to get out of this? What is your take, and what is your analysis, and what is your hopefulness?
Yeah, much like the Fed these days, there's sort of this really weird chicken or egg thing where the markets are not freaking out because they expect that the Fed will do something, or they expect the debt ceiling thing will get resolved. But then to get the debt ceiling thing resolved, you sort of thought there would have to be a market collapse. And so it would get resolved one way or the other. But the question is, which would come first? And
right. Who's going to turn their key first?
Yeah. And I've been connecting it to the Fed in the sense that that's sort of the big issue right now with the Fed just kind of irrationally continuing to tighten. Is I think the Fed is deeply frustrated that markets haven't freaked out and credit spreads haven't widened and stock market hasn't crashed further and things like that. But along this debt ceiling thing, you can imagine, because I know you do TV plenty, the frustration of like something that's very nuanced and complex, and everyone wants the opinion in 3 minutes or less, or sometimes 30 seconds or less. And my thought all along has been that I disagree with the notion of having a debt ceiling, but I'm a balanced budget guy. And so the reason I don't think there should be a debt ceiling is you're talking about nothing other than just periodic political manipulation around something that Congress has recklessly agreed to do. And it just sets itself up for a lot of theatrics and things like that. But I do believe Speaker McCarthy deserves kudos for, getting his bill passed with his caucus, which is an unbelievably difficult caucus, in a lot of ways, far more difficult even than what Boehner dealt with 12 years ago, because I think the Freedom Caucus then, there were some flamethrowers, but there were a lot less performative people then than now. And now you have some of the kind of theatrics combined with rank idiocy. And that was a potential firecracker. And he more or less kept things in line. The whole game all along was, you're not really going to shut down the government. And I think you have to deal with months of both the White House and the media abjectly lying about a default versus reordering bill payment, but missing a principal payment on the Treasury bonds with the amount of incoming cash flows they had was utterly ridiculous.
I want you to stop for 2 seconds and explain that point, because this is a very big frustration of mine.
Yeah.
Like, how does it just that, like the whole idea that we would default the second we didn't have cash on hand to pay off debt presupposes that we couldn't sort of stop other payments internally in the American political system to pay off creditors first, because that's I understand it's politically unpalatable, but it's not economically or financially undoable. I mean, is that what you do in your real life? Is like, oh my God, I have to keep my light bill on, so I'm going to hold off paying off this credit card or paying for or buying groceries or whatever it is to make sure that I pay my Con Ed bill. That's what the government could do with paying off these debt payments, right?
and a household has generally a fair amount of discretionary expenditures in front of their have tos, like let's say a house payment. And in the government's case, they have significantly more. I mean, remember, the government brings in $4 trillion a year revenue. So they are spending more, and that's not good. That's what we call a deficit, annual budget deficit that can run anywhere between 1 and 2 trillion. And that's basically baked in these days, no matter who's president, it seems. But that's still, you would have to have 80% of a revenue decline to say you're going to default. And our annual interest service on the debt is about 8% of the budget. So if we found that there were 92% other things we had to spend money on first, now, I would argue you could put Social Security payments and military pensions and things like that up there. But in the past, what have they done? Like they shut down like national parks or something. Usually one of the Clinton shutdown, I remember this one because my dad was still alive, and my dad making the argument that this is why a government is too big, because they shut it down for, wasn't it about a month? Mm-hmm. and no one really knew it even happened.
Right.
Like there's a lot of money they spend money on. And look, there are actually people on a micro basis that get affected by that. So I don't want the people that make hourly wages working at the souvenir stand at Washington Monument to not get paid. I mean, but my point is it's not a default. A default is a missed principal or interest payment. It's a technical term. And every single person in the media and the White House and the Treasury Department who's been using that term knows that they've been using it dishonestly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I interrupted you to take you off path here. So what do you think is going to happen next?
So, I mean, they have to vote tomorrow, and it doesn't look, Mark Halperin had a line in his little daily political commentary this morning that I think is pretty much accurate. When AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene are both for something, it's probably going to pass. And when those two, who are kind of the far right and far left lunatics of the Congress, are both against something, it's still probably going to pass. But when they're both for it, which they are, and Jim Jordan is for it, look, there's it looks to me about 6 or 7 of these guys, and like a Chip Roy, I don't think is lunatic. There's a couple of the ones that are out there, barking against this thing that it really didn't matter what it was, they were going to bark against it. And for the most part, it seems that Trump and DeSantis have not said anything that is giving a political reason to not be behind it. So I think McCarthy got the best deal he could. I don't think it has anything to do with the real issue. That whether Republican or Democrat, we spend too much money, we borrow too much money to pay for the spending, and we have no interest in having a conversation about what it's doing to economic growth, which is my fundamental economic mission in life. And that's the real issue. And the debt ceiling thing just gives us a little stage or a one act play to kind of play around with this stuff. But ultimately, until somebody is really serious about budget cuts, which Americans typically only do in an emergency, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, so 2 points, one on the political part and one on the policy part. On the political part, it seems to me that I agree with you entirely and I've been very harsh on Kevin McCarthy, but Kevin McCarthy deserves a lot of credit. Like he's done much better than I would have thought. And trying to figure out why he's done much better than I would have thought, I think part of the answer, it's only a partial part of it, but is that it turns out that when you have a very narrow margin, right, 4 seats, and one of those seats is owned by George Santos, it makes everybody have a lot more responsibility and accountability than they otherwise would. There's no cost to being a braying jackass when you have a 30, 40 seat majority, right? Because you can just be performative all you like. When everybody essentially can be the deciding vote on something, it injects a little sobriety, at least into some people. Moreover, I think one of the smartest things that McCarthy did, and I don't know if it was happenstance or strategery, I don't know, but was actually put a bunch of House Freedom Caucus guys on the Rules Committee. Because, this is something I've been making this point about federalism and 1,000 other things for a very long time. you get more responsible behavior from people when you give them more responsibility, right? And so now you have these guys on the committee who are actually decisive to the process. And so they're going to take the process more seriously than they otherwise might. At least I think that's part of it. And because they are House Freedom Caucus guys, if it makes it out of the Rules Committee, not just this, but previous legislation that McCarthy's gotten passed, it makes it more difficult for the House Freedom Caucus guys outside the committee to crap all over it because it's got the imprimatur of their fellow, hotheads on it. And so I think there's a lesson in there that is worth, thinking about. And on the policy side, you can respond to that in a second. Would you be in favor of, there's some proposals out there to simply automatically build in a raising of the debt limit once you vote to appropriate funds, right? Which is sort of intuitively I agree with you. I'm a balanced budget guy, and I think, and I'll be glad if we get some spending cuts out of all this deal, but I also don't like normalizing making the credit limit a opportunity to sort of extract concessions. You should do it during the budget process. You shouldn't just play games with the full faith and credit and credit standing of the United States of America. When Kevin McCarthy said, look, every family knows that if your kid goes crazy with the credit card, it's time to start talking about family expenses. I got no problem with that analogy, except insofar as if you take that analogy seriously, what he's saying is, and that's why we're going to call the credit card companies and threaten them to not pay our bills. Yeah. It's just a different thing. But anyway, what do you think about both of those points?
Well, essentially on the second, I totally agree, although I would word it even differently. I don't even think we need an automatic increase of a debt ceiling. I just think we don't need a debt ceiling. It's sort of a vocabulary thing. Like there's a tautology to saying once we appropriate funds, then we approve that we're going to pay for the funds we approved. I mean, we should not be debating whether or not we're going to pay for things that we agreed to pay for. But we should not be agreeing to pay for all these things. And so in the name of fiscal conservatism, I don't think politically we'll move the ball without a balanced budget amendment. And I think that's what should happen. And then the problem right now is we really do struggle, much like that whole dynamic. I think you and I have even talked about it. I think something like 94% still say they hate Congress and like 60% say they like their congressman or congresswoman. You still have a huge problem with people almost universally saying government spends too much money. And then you put anything in front of them. Do you want to cut this? And they say no.
Right. And except for foreign aid, which is like 1% or 0.1% of our budget. It's nothing.
Yeah. So when they talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, that stuff is politically cute, but it doesn't move any needle. And it's sort of like, it's funny because I remember when Jolene and I first got married and I was building a financial services career. This was a very different stage in my balance sheet and income statement. And like, we're buying things that would cost a lot of money. And then she would say like something about it'd be equivalent to like the HBO Max now, or like one of the $9 streaming things. And I'm like, well, you just bought a $10,000 couch. And then you're wondering about the, $10, my USCfootball.com subscription or something. And that's how most people do treat the budget is they're saying like, oh, the Pentagon, with their waste on these toilet seats, the big thing back in the 90s or 80s or whatever it was. And there were some silly, embarrassing things that should not be happening. But we don't talk seriously about the fact that 62% of federal outlays are transfer payments. And so if you're not going to talk about healthcare, Medicaid, Medicare, social, which, one of the leading presidential candidates right now, who used to be the president, has decided that going after entitlements is the non-conservative thing to do. And I just don't even know what world I'm living in anymore. That he thought it would be a political vulnerability to DeSantis that he has talked sort of responsibly and fiscally about entitlements. And yet that's the only thing that you're ever going to do to really move the budget. I think you're going to have to do spending caps across each department. And then ultimately the Fed's going to end up monetizing a bunch of the debt. That's what will happen.
Yeah. I mean, Mansur Olson in his Why States Rise and Fall, or whatever the name of the book was, he makes the argument that really the only way you get past the sclerotic nature of huge sort of bureaucratized government systems is when you have a war and everything gets torn down and you get to start fresh. And that's the real secret to like Japanese and German growth post World War II and all that. I don't want that. But like, I mean, I really do. Like, I was just reading our friend Kevin Williamson's piece about Ukraine. You know, like it may be that the best way for Ukraine to finally conquer its corruption problems is this existential crisis of nearly being destroyed by Russia. And it gives people the permission to simply scrap whole interest groups and coalitions in the name of this overriding priority kind of thing. And the only reason I bring it up is that I honestly think you could probably cut if you had the right bureaucrats, you could cut the bureaucracy enormously and streamline the government in all sorts of ways. I just don't know how the amount of political capital required to do it versus the amount of returns in terms of spending that you get. It can't be that much of a priority, right? I mean, I get the waste, fraud, and abuse stuff. And Medicare fraud is a real thing for sure, but it's not fraud by government officials. It's people fooling government officials into getting payments. And we could make a lot more money if we gave more money to, say, the FBI or whoever to investigate Medicare fraud than we could by streamlining the Medicare bureaucracy.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That's always been the case. I think that it's difficult. Like, I don't want to say that we shouldn't take those things seriously. I'm saying when we get down to talking about balanced budget amendment, and a lot of like my supply side friends, and I'm as religiously supply side as anybody could be, including Laffer and Kudlow and all these guys who are, you know, in Larry's case, a very good friend of mine. But they're always worried that a balanced budget amendment will require tax increases as opposed to spending cuts. And I think that much like the tax increase debate, the reason why the left doesn't make a lot of progress with like the estate tax is because they know it doesn't really raise revenue. And with us on spending cuts, like we know that we can attack this fraud thing here, and there's certain areas that are wasteful there, but it doesn't really move the needle. When you start dealing with this many commas and zeros, there's kind of just major line items that have to be addressed. And this is where I think the populist moment will end up dying. And I think it's years away. But you won't get to reshape the size of government apart from an intellectual foundation, right? There will have to be an appeal to first things to get there. And any conversation about the size of government ultimately will lean into a worldview. And so pride in not having a worldview, pride in only functioning off of a particular emotive impulse at a point in time or history won't be the stuff that rebudgeting the federal government is made of. I think it's going to be much more Buckleyite than it is Bannonite when all's said and done. But that the problem is what the catalyst to getting there is. And this is where, you know, the stuff I talk about all the time with Japanification. And we do have a difficult thing in front of us where we don't know what that point is. Like that was one of the things that gave McCarthy a lot of leverage in a micro case with the debt ceiling is Janet Yellen kept saying the X date is this, the X date's that. And she's probably the one coming out of this looking the weakest because nobody took her seriously ever. And she'd come out and say the government will run out of money on this day, and Bloomberg would pop up and CNBC and all this stuff, and the market would just close up like 100 points. And so I think that there is a serious thing out there, but I've been using this stat a lot at speaking engagements lately. We're at 31 trillion in debt, and we were a little less than 1 trillion when Reagan left office, and that's when I was in high school. So now I'm going to be turning 50 in a year. And if someone had said, when I graduated high school, when you're 50, we're going to have 30 times the national debt we have now. What do you think bond yields will be? What do you think the stock market will be? What do you think economic growth will be? I would have just laughed. It would have been incomprehensible. And so where that moment is that budgetary seriousness has to come, I don't know. But the one thing I do want to at least fight against is this continued cycle of a Republican president, Republican Congress not caring, and then a Democrat president, Republican Congress, then we care again as Republican. That's the cycle we've been in pretty much since Reagan left office.
Yeah.
And
go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just totally inexcusable. And right now, I'm surprised that McCarthy was able to get the leverage he was in this debate. Because there's obviously been media, demonstrations of this, but the moral authority is not with the Republicans on this. And all that people have had to do is just make hay over and over of how much this national debt thing pre-COVID Trump is what we're dealing with. I mean, look, Bush Jr. did a lot, but it's nowhere near what people thought. And I don't mean to belittle this, but the war's soaking wet cost less in 20 years than Trump spent like in one bill. You know what I mean? And then Obama was a huge spender, and we know that continued then through 3 years of Trump and discretionary spending pre-COVID. Then, of course, COVID blew it out, and Biden's add-on bill was just completely ridiculous. But there's no sense, and that was the thing about the Tea Party moment, as brief as it was, is they were not just hammering Obama. They were hammering Bush. And now I think it's remarkable that some of these Freedom Caucus guys who voted for all Trump spending have been able to get away with this as long as they have.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my great frustrations is that the people who are the most likely to bleat and moan about zombie Reaganism are the ones entirely in favor of massive deficit spending. And the thing is like, I remember when the American Experience, whatever, maybe it was Frontline, whatever, PBS did their big sort of profile, bio thing on Reagan. And I guess it was the early 2000s. And I did a piece for the Wall Street Journal about it. And it was interesting. It was one of these sort of Edmund Morris talked to them, and it was one of these sort of like, oh, Reagan's finally getting a little deference from the sort of PBS, New York Times, elite liberal opinion crowd. But it closed with like, but there's still the downside of Reagan years, which was, of course, the out of control deficit spending and the massive debt that he hung on America. And I remember writing a piece about how, well, this is good news for Reagan because today, or whatever, and I was writing this, it's like deficits are now considered bipartisan fine by Democrats. They don't have any problem with them whatsoever. They had problems with Reagan's. But the thing about Reagan's was, and there are good faith arguments against this point, Reagan's was deeply tied up with winning the Cold War. And like,
it was entirely tied up with it. I mean, that's the whole thing is transfer payment. As a percentage of GDP, the welfare state came down substantially. And so this is where the fiscal hawks get kind of tied in knots, because my argument has never been only that the problem with the welfare state is we can't afford it. I don't think we can afford it. But my primary critique of the welfare state is that it is impoverishing of the human spirit. And I think it's immoral. And in Reagan's case, the spending went up, as you said, entirely as a percentage of expenditure growth around defense and military spending. And the percentage decreased in terms of transfer payments. That, to me, seems to me to be the exact moral trajectory that we want. And even in Clinton's case, where government spending went up, the denominator, the debt went up, but the debt to GDP ratio came down. And so if McCarthy used that the household credit card analogy, I think they're usually pretty good to do, household to government. The problem is we talk about government stuff with GDP a lot, and we mix up income statement versus balance sheet. If we were doing real accounting analogies, we end up doing apples to oranges accidentally. But the bottom line is the debt to GDP ratio is the real issue. The absolute dollar amount can sound kind of horrifying, but this is where the Japanification thing comes in. If in theory we were going to grow debt 3% per year for all eternity from here, from where we are now, that 30 trillion compounded at 3% is just going to look ridiculous and sound like cats and dogs are about to start falling out of the sky. But if GDP was growing, real GDP was growing at 3 or more than 3%, you could probably get away with it forever. A household can grow spending as much as they want if income is still growing the same or more. The issue is that the government spending we're talking about, the numerator, by definition, takes away from the denominator. I can grow my output as an earner and therefore grow expenditures at a ratio that I can manage. In the government's case, because they don't have any output, all that you're talking about is with them increasing spending, decreasing that denominator. And that's what Japanification ultimately is you run out of productive uses of debt. And that's what our government ran into about 15 years ago.
Yeah, and my point about the Cold War stuff is, for return on investment, the ROI on like getting rid of this existential struggle that consumed the United States for a half century or more is worth $1 trillion of debt, And but like, what is the $29 trillion in debt? What has been the return on that, right? And this is a criticism of Republicans and Democrats alike. And I'm not saying that we got nothing for that 29 trillion, but like, I'm hard pressed to think of something, and I'll throw in the Iraq War and all, Afghan War, which I think is a mistake, because you don't do wars as investment things. You do wars as for other reasons as well. But I personally, I would be much more comfortable if we had spent maybe not 30 trillion, but say 15 trillion on actually curing Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's-like diseases. And if we had successfully done that, the ROI would be huge, because we spend hundreds of billions of dollars treating people, treating the symptoms of it. It's a terrible way to end your life. It's very expensive for the system. And if we could cure that, the cost savings would be just enormous for the budget. And so I'm not opposed to sort of thinking about how do we amortize this debt for big, important things, so long as long-term, the return on it is greater than the investment. And we just don't think in those terms. We think, with all the COVID stuff, most of that was funding bureaucracies, not funding the recipients of government largesse, right? It is coalitional politics masquerading as concern for the little guy, when in fact it's spending on the helping professions that work for the little guys. I mean, what has New York gotten out of the billions of dollars it's put into spending on homelessness and drug treatment for the last X number of years, when the problem seems to have only gotten worse? Having government should be in the business of solving its problems, not medicating its, not prolonging the problems. And I think that's part of the long-term sort of socially stagnating problem with the vision of a lot of government stuff these days.
And it's sort of the high-level philosophical critique against the Great Society, right? That of 50 years later, all the money spent on poverty programs and the basic metrics have all stayed the same or gotten worse. That there isn't really any empirical evidence of any improvement. And the thing, when you talk about the 30 trillion, that's not the spending. That's the spending above and beyond revenue. Right. So the total expenditures, including those expenditures that were paid for without debt, are monumental. And I think you're right that probably the largest ROI in government expenditures, certainly of our lifetime, but maybe since the founding, was the defeat of Soviet Cold War communism and the peace dividend. And I don't just mean because existentially we're not dead and there wasn't a nuclear war. And I also mean measurable in financial markets. I talk to kind of perma-bear guys all the time on Wall Street that will talk about how debt is going to ruin the world. And I'll say, were you saying that in 1990? Because look how much the debt's worsened over 30 years. And then they'll say, yeah, but I didn't know we were going to get a peacetime dividend. That I did not know that we'd go into the 90s and have these years where, people always talk about the technology boom during the Clinton presidency. But really, you did have this substantial kind of repricing of risk globally around that diminishment of Soviet threat, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all that stuff. And then I think that that in the 2000s, the Islamic jihadism threat that became so headline-centric post 9/11, I don't think that that was ever priced into global markets the way the 50-year Cold War was, because it was seen as a real threat. You guys like you and me, of course, were never quiet about that or hardly guilty of minimizing the threat. But I don't think it was ever seen as systemic in the sense of two superpowers nuking each other out. It was almost a little scarier because it was like, well, they start bombing playgrounds and amusement parks and things. And so it had a certain awakening of global reality, but it wasn't priced into financial markets the way that the Cold War lingered for decades. So that's a measurable benefit that came out of the Reagan years. And, a cure for Alzheimer's, a cure for cancer, there's all these things that you could say, if we could point to that, wouldn't that be real great evidence? But I think ultimately, if people were to look at what money has been spent on, that's a bigger problem that some people would not be aghast, that they would argue a sort of codification of a high percentage of people on food stamps, welfare, various forms of social assistance, and then a kind of governmental pension program with a medical kicker between social and Medicare. I think many people would view that as a positive. And the economics of a social safety net do not have to be this bad. You can have a social safety net, and they don't have to be this catastrophic.
All right. So last question on the economic stuff before we get to the fun stuff. Sorry. But you have been walking around in your sandwich board, ringing your bell about the real problem with inflation is deflation and all this stuff for a long time now. You've been on here many times to talk about it. You send out a very useful and interesting email to friends and associates on this stuff.
That just goes to you.
Really? You just do it. You just wake up in the morning. I got to get this to Jonah. I would find that would make me feel unsafe if I thought that were true.
It would be kind of depressing.
So are you sticking to your, I understand your macro point, your long-term point about the Japanification of America and all that kind of stuff, but inflation still seems to be fairly persistent, longer than it seemed like when you were talking about this stuff, say, a year ago, it would be. Have you revised your view? I'm just giving you a chance to sort of, what's your latest view on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, the back to the need to go into nuance and real numbers, real analysis. The fact of the matter, goods inflation is 0% for an entire year. Goods inflation annualized for 6 months and 9 months is negative. It is deflationary. The total headline inflation number is still positive, with 34% of the weighting coming from shelter, a combined measurement of rents, current rents, and then what they call owner's equivalent rent. If people believe that the current CPI measurement of shelter which is 8.3%, if they believe that is accurate, then they should say, look, inflation is sticking around. You have something in the range of the high fours, and 34% of that is 8.3. So it is contributing 2.8% to inflation. If, however, one looks at the real price of rents and housing year over year as somewhere between up 2% or down 2%, I think it's right around the flat line, as every single metric anybody could look at, Zillow, national apartment rent, realtor, There are Case-Shiller. There are a dozen different measurements of both rents and house prices. And I don't have to insist that they're down, although when I think about 30 states, they are down, but they're essentially flatlined. But the lag effect of the way this measures shelter is still causing a substantially outdated input. So the inflation rate, if it's normalized for an accurate shelter, is essentially 2% right now, maybe 2.5% soaking wet. And that's what they were trying to get it to for 15 years post-financial crisis. I think that everything I've ever said on your podcast and in my writing, and I'm not a I told you so kind of guy because I get a lot of things wrong. And if you're going to do what I do, manage many, many, many billions of dollars for a living, you are going to be wrong sometimes. And making a big deal out of being wrong is not a good idea because it's not a big deal to be wrong. It comes with this territory. Our friend Cliff could talk about this. Cliff has plenty to say on this as well. It's what we do. You're in something that has a lot of multivariant explanations, but in this case, I was not wrong. And if I were wrong, I would have said so. The charts universally look the same, that there was this spike higher in the cost of producing goods and services, of transporting containers, of moving things out of China, of any element of the supply chain globally, of ships, of vessels getting into our ports, of cargo getting off of the ports, of laborers getting their hands on the cargo to get it to end destination. And with various other complexities that entered the fray, the singular story from an Occam's razor standpoint was that we shut down the world from the production of goods and services, and then we opened up the world. And the reopening of demand goes quickly, and the reopening of supply does not. That was what caused the inflation. And to the extent that there could be a sugar high of added demand with the Biden spending or the Biden-Trump spending, the $2,000 that everyone gave. But the thing is that we already now know, without me having to theoretically make the case or before scream from the hilltops, will someone please explain Japan? People would say, no. Anytime the government prints this much money or spends this much money, it's inflationary. And I would say, okay, so now do Japan. And whether it was kind of a layman on the street or some knucklehead on Twitter or real serious finance people or real serious academics, macro economists, classical or Keynesian, please explain Japan. The answers always came back, I don't understand Japan either. But all I know is I think that printing more money is automatically inflationary. So now velocity's raised its ugly head again where it's collapsed. Loan demand has collapsed. And core goods inflation is negative. But why should it have stopped? That $5 trillion that was added has not gone anywhere. The only reason that the inflation rate is not at 10%, if those people were right, is because that money has stopped turning over. And the low velocity that we've been struggling with since about 2003, 4, 5, it began escalating in America, meaning the downward pressure on velocity began escalating. And then post-crisis, it's never really changed. So I think that the Fed is perfectly capable of manufacturing inflation with low interest rates on things like housing, highly levered parts of the economy that are asset prices. And then inversely, I think they've put downward pressure now by raising mortgage rates. But why is the price of plastics and cosmetics and just household goods all come down to a basically 0% inflation year over year? Demand has not moved. There is absolutely no decrease in the demand of these goods and services, none. And everyone screamed that as good Phillips curvers, we had better get a whole lot of unemployment or this inflation is going to get out of control. But we have lower unemployment than we did a year ago. We have higher wages, and yet prices, the rate of price growth has come substantially down. The rate of inflation has been cut in half, and even that is based on a faulty CPI number. So I think that the real issue we're dealing with that will now become the big headline story again. And a whole lot of people on the political right are about to start agreeing with me once the election of 24 is over. It was an irresistible political opportunity to pin the inflation on Biden. If I were a political consultant, I would have done it. If I were a campaign manager. But and I think Biden played a role, because if my supply side theory is correct, that we lacked the production of goods and services to meet the needs in the economy, and that put upward pressure on prices, I think Biden was responsible for some of that by extending all the unemployment and kind of, incentivizing people to stay out of the workforce. These unmet jobs were a real problem. But you did not have 41,000 people who handle packages at Federal Express leave their job in 1 year because of the Fed printing money. It just isn't true. And so I think we're dealing with a substantial problem of government malfeasance. Yet I think instead of it being long-term inflationary, it is secular disinflationary. And we're just very lucky that it doesn't turn into outright deflation and sustained deflation like it has in Japan, because we still have a wildly productive economy and an awful lot of inherent advantages. But what we're dealing with is running substantially below our capacity, and I think it's totally unacceptable.
Okay, I'm going to do one quick John Podhoretz kind of explainer for people. If I get it wrong, you correct me. But a lot of people don't understand the velocity point, and so just to explain to people, the whole point of the Japan comparison is that you can dump out of helicopters, whatever, large amounts of money into an economy, and yes, and you can give it to the poorest people. The poorest people will spend it, but very quickly those dollars they end up in a bank, right? They end up in a business's bank account somewhere, and then the bank sits on these accounts and is forced to. It has two choices. It could either invest it in something where they anticipate a meaningful return on their investment, or they can sit on it and wait to find a worthwhile investment for that money that's in the account. And the velocity of money thing the argument is less. It has to do with less with how much money you just pump into an economy, but how fast those dollars keep changing hands. Because there are productive investments to put in, and that's what creates economic growth. You get deflation or stagflation or moribund economic growth, whatever terms we want to use, when you keep pumping money into the economy, and sure, it gets spent once, it gets spent twice, but then it kind of just sloshes around in the economy because there's no good place for that money to go. And that's what's happened in Japan. That's basically your argument about what's going on here. Do I have that right?
I think you have it extremely right. When you said the Podhoretz thing, it occurred to me you meant it's a Podhoretz tactic to explain to others, where I thought you meant we were going to explain it to Podhoretz.
No. I just mean, and I gave him grief for this because the best example of this was, I don't know, 8 months ago, they were on the commentary podcast, and they were talking about something going on in the Republican caucus, and someone said, and Kevin McCarthy is going to go blah, and John stops the entire conversation to say, and Kevin McCarthy is the House Minority Leader of the Republican Party. And it's like, and I gave him grief for it. And he said, yeah, but the problem is whenever I hear Kevin McCarthy, he thinks of the guy from the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie, who's the actor named Kevin McCarthy. And he just sort of projects that mistake on other people, which I don't think is the best sort of, explanation.
That's pretty good projection. No, I joke because poor John has probably been the biggest victim of my shooting off emails. I'll be listening to one of their podcasts. They'll say something on the inflation thing that upsets me, and then I immediately stop and send him an email, and then he has to have me on to clarify the view or what have you. And
no, I know he is obsessed with your inflation stuff.
But I think the velocity thing ultimately requires people to understand where new money comes from. And so I always have to remind people with banking, because this stuff does get complicated. And there's a real benefit for highfalutin economists that most people don't understand it. So they can sort of say stuff. It sounds a little fancy, if not impressive. I mean, Paul Krugman's been doing this his entire career. And then they kind of are able to get enough listeners or readers to just say, I don't fully know what he's talking about, but it makes sense, and then move on to something else. And I don't really like doing that. Like I view one of the burdens I have in my adult life is trying to get people to understand economics in a way that gets past platitudes and becomes sort of actionable. And, it's a frustration of mine being a guy on the right for my whole life that people sort of say things without really understanding what they mean. And this is true of money supply. Where does new money come from, right? If I deposit new money of mine at the bank, is there now more money in circulation? But see, of course, all I did was move money from bank A to bank B. Maybe it was the bank account of one of my clients who paid me to my bank account, but there was no new money created in that. And so where does new money get created? You go with the Fed printing it. But even then, with quantitative easing, they're buying treasury bonds, and they hold those in excess reserves at the bank. So to your point earlier, it's just sitting there. The velocity is what turns it over. So where does velocity pick up? New money creation as money's turning over from loan demand. It's not depositing new money, it's borrowing new money. That can become new money in circulation. And my argument, which is just undisputable out of the precedent of Japan and Europe and America over the post-financial crisis years, is that there's a law of diminishing return there. And this is theory of marginal utility, is classical economics 101. It's basic Austrian economics, that all economics is done at the margin. And that my first In-N-Out burger that I'll pay $7 for is very good. But the 40th one, I'm not paying $7 for because I already got sick 29 burgers ago. Wait, did I eat 10 of them? That's disgusting. There's some number.
We get the point. Yeah.
And when it comes to loan demand, there is downward pressure on available borrowers and available projects. And so we were talking earlier about the return on governmental debt. Well, yeah, you end the Cold War here and you cure Alzheimer's there, but at some point you're buying Pentagon toilet seats. And that's the problem, is out of the financial crisis, we re-levered corporate America, and Blackstone and Apollo and a lot of these groups did incredibly productive things with debt. But then now you start dealing with the bad projects and bad borrowers because they're already levered. And I think that as a national economic statement, we are far past the point of getting a high revenue product on our debt. It's been downward facing for some time. And this is where the expression pushing on a string comes in. And it's also where Keynes very candidly argued from using fiscal stimulus from a starting point of equilibrium, not already being in 2 trillion deficits and 31 trillion of debt. And so I think that various Keynesian endeavors have been underwhelming for a long time because, most of those big low-hanging fruit projects are far beyond us. So I think that this is the part that we'll end up dealing with politically, that 1.6% real GDP growth makes a lot of people mad about how rich Elon Musk is. And 3.1% real GDP growth doesn't. And that's where I think we stand. And that real GDP growth has enabled it being so underwhelming. And there being such a lower robustness of economic vitality and dynamism. That's where the new right gets their momentum. I'm candidly pretty surprised, Jonah, at how many of these guys, some of which I think are brighter than others and making more serious arguments than others, all of which I more or less disagree with. But I really think it's fascinating that there's a sort of post-hoc fallacy going on where they'll say, look at what has happened since China joined the WTO, and it's all underwhelming. Globalization failed to deliver, and fusionism failed to deliver. And now we need to use certain economic forces to generate virtue and get more economic benefit to workers. And I'll say, okay, well, I want all these things. I want more virtue. I want greater standard of living for workers too. But have you not noticed that at the same time you're talking about fusionism and WTO and China, that's also the point at which national debt exploded? That's also the point at which the Fed began taking a highly interventionist role in the American economy? Is it possible that you just got your post hoc wrong? That the causation is a different. Your timeline might be about right, but your causation is wrong. That's really what I believe.
All right, so we went much longer on the economic stuff than I had planned, but I find it interesting, and I just decided to keep conversations going when I find it interesting.
That's where I'll say to your listeners, you're welcome.
But so let's change gears just slightly. You name checked Cliff. You didn't say last name earlier. Cliff Asness, who's a friend of ours. Lest people think that I am concealing my biases, he's a friend of mine. Like Harlan Crow is a friend of mine. Cliff Asness endowed a chair at the American Enterprise Institute, the Cliff and Laurel Asness Chair in Applied Liberty, which I inhabit. I actually have a camping chair on the roof that I use on the roof of AEI to write the G file quite often. And in Sharpie, I have written the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty on it. So people can discount my biases however they like. I make no apologies for the friends that I have. And that said, Cliff gave this great talk at the Manhattan Institute. We'll put a link to the video in the show notes. And he asked me to introduce him, which was a little controversial. Not that Raihan has a huge problem with me. We're old friends. Raihan Salam is the president of the Manhattan Institute. But I'm an AEI guy. It's a Manhattan event, whatever. But Raihan was generous in letting me do the intro. And Cliff gave a great talk where he defended the quote unquote donor class. Now, I want to be really clear. The donor class is a enormously capacious term. There are many rooms in the mansion, and it's a really nice mansion, of the donor class. And I don't think you or I would dispute for a nanosecond that there are many, 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 many people of means out there who have a transactional relationship with government, with politicians, that they expect an ROI on their donations and that sort of thing. Those people exist. I think one of the things, and you can respond to this later if you like, that explains Donald Trump's worldview about politics is that he's such a creature of New York City, where he's very used to the sort of standard urban corrupt model of, oh, you need a variance on some zoning, you need a cutout on a thing, you slip a guy on the city council X amount of money kind of thing. And so he thinks that, and he ran the presidency very much as the mayor of America, because that's how he thinks all politics is transactional like that. Those people exist. And Trump has admitted that he paid politicians to get something for it and all that kind of stuff. That said, the people like the Koch brothers or George Soros, or, to a lesser degree, Cliff Asness or Harlan Crow or a 100 other people, in my experience, and again, this is a selection bias thing, because I don't have a lot to do with the other kinds of super rich people for all sorts of reasons. Cliff's point was that for the most part, these people are doing what they're doing in terms of helping with think tanks and places like National Review Institute and others, because they actually believe it. Right. The example I've used for 20 years now in columns is, if you try to annualize, I don't think Charles and David, what was Charles and, what's the other main Koch brother's name? David. Yeah. I was thinking, because there's 4 of them, but 2 of them are sort of wayward.
Yeah. And David since passed away, but Charles and David were the 2 conservatives.
Right. But Charles is the von Miesian guy, right?
Yeah. David was too, but Charles is real von Miesian. And
so, if you look at, I very much doubt Charles paid himself much of a salary, right? But if you look at what his annual income is, or a fraction of his wealth, or anything like this, there is no way, by any approved measure of accounting or financial advice, and you'll check me on this if I'm wrong, that it is worth a multi-billionaire's time to write a book on von Miesian-based management theory, right? No book advance will ever justify that. He does it because he believes it, right? Most of these guys care about, like Betsy DeVos has no personal investment in school choice. She believes in it. And I think that this is one of these things that a lot of the criticism that used to be very much a left-wing thing and is now a bipartisan right-wing thing is that people extrapolate from their own worldview and assume it's like mirroring in foreign policy. And they assume other people have the same motives that they do. And it turns out that they don't. There are a lot of people who do a lot of things with their money because they get a real reward because they think they're doing something to help the world. Anyway, what do you think of all this stuff? In your experience, where would you divide, the world of transactionalists versus idealists in this stuff?
I agree emphatically, and it's an issue that is actually a real irritant for me. I'm a pretty significant political donor, and I just want to assure people that if I'm doing it for a personal financial advantage, I'm super bad at it, really bad. There are, of course, donors that are opportunistic and transactional. And yet I actually think that where that happens at scale is at a local level. You have city councils, greasing the skids, this and that. And even then, they're usually hiring lobbyists to help with zoning things and environmental impact reports and so forth. And a lot of that, too, over time, and I'm not sure where the kind of libertarian in me feels about all this. A lot of that stuff is just hard to do now because, you have to be public hearings and they can't really negotiate privately. And the no bid stuff is pretty rare. And it's just kind of hard to get those sort of sweetheart deals people used to get. But on a national level, the major donors that people have caricaturized, and obviously we have Koch on the right, Soros on the left, but there's a ton of others. It's entirely ideological. And not only is it that they're sincere, but the other problem to their evil masters of the universe theory, either from the right or left, is that these people lose all the time. Harlan had said that in an interview over the weekend about, I wasn't able to stop Trump from getting elected or Obama from getting elected so you have these big donors. They say the establishment's doing all this. Trump won, Hillary lost, Biden. Where are these people getting the success stories I keep hearing about that their power and money and evil put together are supposed to provide? It does seem to me that there's a big war of ideas out there, and there are some wealthy people have strong opinions that engage in it. And the notion that it's all sinister does come from it's populism, but really it comes from a certain covetousness. That we assume that there's people who believe the rich and powerful got to be that way by ill-gotten means, and that once they are there, that they're up to no good. And I think, I don't remember who first said it, but that this idea I thought was pretty funny that Trump spent money the way that a poor person thinks rich people spend money.
Right.
Remember, you know what I'm talking about?
It's a poor person's idea of what a rich person is.
Exactly. Yeah. It may have been Kevin Williamson who said it or stole it from someone else, but I always thought that was kind of clever and interesting. But I hear people say like Bill Gates, who I'm not really a Bill Gates fan. I think he was kind of a dirty guy, the way he made a lot of his money. He was super smart and whatnot. But this conspiratorial stuff, where people say like, oh yeah, he owns a piece of these vaccines. And I always think that they suffer from an understanding of marginal economics. He's worth $100 billion. And what is it you think he wants to do with his next $100 billion?
Right.
That he
or no, his next $2 billion, right?
Billion?
Yeah.
And let's say you believe he's an Epstein pervert guy.
Right.
You got enough, you can perv out.
Right.
You don't need the next $100 billion to, you know what I'm saying? I just don't get what people really believe about it. And yet that doesn't mean Soros isn't dead wrong and in some cases evil and ideologically challenged. I disagree with a lot of the big wealthy left-wing donors, but I don't generally think that they're up to something corrupt or running a Manchurian candidate program or anything like this. And yet this is the underlying problem. The thing that Cliff Asness is going after about the people's critique of donor class is basically cut from the same cloth as so much of what people are going after. is rather than be willing to see the world for what it is, which is not a very good place. There's sinful nature. There's all kinds of problems with the nature of man that is a problem to deal with. And we should and could and basically do have those conversations, but we feel the need to go to create a narrative that helps us make more sense of it. And for whatever reason, it seems to make more sense to people to believe that the rich and powerful have this kind of, it's almost glorifying it in a way. They have an elevated capacity for getting things done that anyone who spends time around these efforts knows is just simply untrue. And there's sort of I'm not a big baseball fan. I'm a big basketball and football fan. People have talked forever about the ball clubs with unlimited salary capacity, and yet they don't really win World Series that much. And they'll win a little here and there, but there's no evidence that the blowout payrolls of some of the major media market baseball teams has led to more success, and you get other teams that kind of buck the trend all the time. How many people, Meg Whitman ran for governor in California, spent $120 million of her own money and lost by like 20 points. I don't see these people being able to get themselves elected with their money, let alone get others elected. It's just a very odd narrative.
Yeah, so I mean, like this is maybe the oldest square on the Remnant bingo card, because it goes back to, I think, the second episode of this thing with Yuval Levin, where, you know, I used to ask this question: what is one thing about Washington that you wish normal Americans understood about Washington? And Yuval's answer was that nobody's really running everything. And I've used this example before. I went to the 2012, the big Coke donors conference, where at the time of maximum left-wing freak out about the Cokes, right? And the New York Times was telling people that they run the world, they control the GOP, they're pulling all these strings and all this kind of stuff. And I get there and it was supposed to be off the record, but I'm not ascribing this to any single person, whatever. And it's now 15 years ago. But I like 11 years ago. People come after me for my math all the time. And anyway, so I get to the big plenary session where everyone's there in one big room, whatever, and they're having some sort of panel discussion. And the overriding theme from all of these people, who I think the average net worth there was probably $75 million, maybe $100 million, but like lots of very rich people. And
75 million. What were you at, a NASCAR hearing? Come on.
Well, look, I mean, like some people bring it down, you know, and then there are other people. I don't know. Like if you factor in the Cokes, maybe it's 1.2 billion, whatever. A lot of rich people and independently rich, right? Because most of the people in the Coke network tend to be not part of publicly traded companies. They tend to have, you know, like
entrepreneurial, closely held business. I've been in the Coke network for years. I know exactly what you're talking about. And
the overriding thing is they pass the microphone around, they take questions, is how come we can't get anything done? How can we cut out the consultants who are stopping us from doing the right thing, blah, 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 blah. They're the middleman. They're the ones ruining everything. And at the same time, if you talk to any political consultant then or now, they would always say, these damn donors, you know, it's like the biggest headache. You got to sort of, you know, reassure them, constantly hold their hand and dance, you know, and blah, 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 blah. And if they would just shut up and give me the check and leave me alone, we can get stuff done. And the truth is, and I think this is just a really basic problem with human psychology, is that there are an enormous number of people. It's why people don't like markets, is they don't like the idea of spontaneous order. They don't like the idea. They want to believe that the goose at the top of the V formation is leading all the geese. They don't want to believe that, no, this is like this is what democracy in a free society looks like, is a bunch of contending power centers fighting with each other peacefully, lawfully, to influence policy, and that nobody is running society. There's no secret room with the great and powerful Oz pulling levers, running the economy or running society in any way. And the problem is if you have a visceral problem with that thought, you are constantly looking for the evidence for your pre-existing thought, and that leads you to conspiracy theories. And that leads you to so-and-so, George Soros is running everything, or the Kochs are running everything, or the CIA is running everything. You go down a long list. Nobody's running everything. It's not a thing.
But I agree completely, Jonah. I think what you're saying, though, I'm just sort of adding to it. Maybe we're all saying it in a different way. It's not merely that they're trying to psychologically or intellectually rationalize things or understand things, but I think it's ultimately therapeutic. They need to believe that there's someone with their hands on the lever. So for me, my great awakening as an adult in this area was financial crisis. I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley. I had a pretty good inside view, and these people were sweating and shaking and had no idea what was happening from 1 minute to the next. And there's Fed governors calling, and they're screaming crazy stuff and then changing their mind 5 minutes later. And this idea that there was this Goldman Sachs evil masters of the universe thing going on in September of 2008, that was quickly revealed to me to be insane. And my dad was a not famous, but well-known, very, very gifted Christian philosopher and epistemologist and so forth. And he used to say that every atheist believes two things. One, there is no God. And two, I hate him. And I think that most of these people that rail against the elites and the Goldman Sachs and the donors and the rich and powerful, that most of them believe, A, these are bad people, and B, I sure hope they're there. That there's something more comforting in believing that Ben Bernanke and Lloyd Blankfein at Goldman, who's the old CEO of Goldman, I'm just characterizing different people. And as you notice, I'm using all Jewish people for a reason.
Of course, yeah. I got it. I got the dog whistle.
There's something comforting for them to believe that those people have their hands on the lever of the universe. And even if they think they're up to no good with it, they do go to bed at night believing those people are on the wall, as Jack Nicholson famously said. And I think that that's an understandable emotional impulse, but it's incredibly disillusioning if you think that, and then you get a chance to see how this stuff really goes. And I've always said that that's the biggest way to kind of reprogram a conspiracy theorist is make them go to a board meeting of a serious organization. And what the line about never meet your heroes, you find out that your heroes kind of are sloppy and make mistakes and can be rude and what have you. And it's disillusioning. But at scale, that's really what conspiracy theorism is.
See, I got a slightly different take on this, and this is a good way to wheedle in some theology here. Is it theodicy? Is that how you pronounce it?
The Odyssey?
Theodicy, right? The struggle to explain to reconcile the existence with evil as the vindication of God, right?
Right.
Like why does God let earthquakes happen? That kind of thing, right? I think that there is a theoditical, I don't know if that's the right word, tendency in human beings that when bad things happen to them, they desperately want to apply agency to it, right? It can't just be that and I know this is very abstract, but this plays into like our litigious culture and all sorts of things, right? It plays into the reaction to the financial crisis. It can't just be that a bunch of people doing their best for the most part with some incompetence built in, some self-dealing built in at the margins and all that kind of thing. People are flawed and all that, including people at the top. But for the most part, like no one wanted the financial crisis to happen, right? No one wanted the Iraq war to go badly. No one wanted Hurricane Katrina to kill a bunch of black people. No one wants the bad things that happen when bad things happen. But there's a thing deep in our nature that wants to ascribe agency to bad things. 9/11, the cover story for 9/11 can't be true, right? It has to be something else that was deliberate and all these kinds of things. And I think that there is a sense of victimization that thrives in conspiracy theories and in fact creates the drive for conspiracy theories. It can't just be that I'm one of the losers in a vast, and I don't mean loser in like a pejorative sense. I just mean you came out worse off because of some major changes in the global economic structure starting with the 1990s. It has to be that the globalists want to punish the little guy. They want to punish the white guy. They want to get rid of the white working class. They want to replace us with Jews or whatever that stuff is, right? And if you start from the premise that there's a real that when bad things happen, it was planned and deliberate by somebody, then that is the Narnian wardrobe into a way of seeing the world that assumes somebody is in charge of everything. And I think it's just a very dark way to live your life, but it makes you feel more important, right? It makes you feel like you matter more. It gives you meaning in your, that's why victimization is so seductive for some people, is because it can't just, it's like, I mean, this is a bad example and I should come up with a different one, but it's popped into my head. When Kennedy was assassinated, his wife, Jackie, said it had to be some pissy little communist. He couldn't have been killed for civil rights. People want the bad things in their lives to have more meaning, and their anger and resentment to have more meaning. And so they have to go find their Moriartys, because if they can find the Moriarty, that makes them Sherlock. And that's not actually how life works.
No, it's a brilliant theory, but it's not really a theory. I think it's a brilliant identification of some of the human psychology at play. There's a kind of grandiosity behind some of it, where you say that like a global pandemic goes and it was just an absolutely unfortunate deal, but an airborne virus, kind of took some people out. That's it's tragic on a micro level, families that were affected and so forth. But it loses some of the sex appeal of saying that China released it to the world to get us, or that the government was doing this, or that, there's a certain grandiosity.
Or that cost Trump his second term. I mean, Trump says that all the time now, is that like they unleashed COVID to cost me, to hurt me. No, they really didn't, Which
I've always agreed with him, that when they released COVID, they also forced him to give the biggest jackassery press conferences in the history of the world.
Right.
That was part of the deal somehow. The irony about that, I guess that was a great segue to talk Trump and politics. That should have been a layup for him to get reelected. A layup. Because you go back through American history, really big, tragic, dramatic events, almost 100% of the time benefit the person in office. Sometimes unfairly, because they didn't really do anything to fix it, but stuff gets fixed or starts to get a little bit better. And just with a little leadership and a little empathy and a little cheerleading, the American people kind of rally around. Look, I think Bush Jr. did a wonderful job post 9/11. I don't have anything to say critical of what happened. His kind of demeanor, him throwing out the pitch at Yankee Stadium, I think it was all great. It had symbolic merit. I don't take away from it. But he didn't deserve a 92% approval rating or whatever. But that's just how we are. And FDR's reelection, throughout history, we generally migrate to people that are there in positions of power during bad times. So that theory never made sense, because all Trump had to do is act a certain way, and it would have accrued to him positively in the politics. I'm certain of it.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's funny. Like, look, I'm not a big fan of Fauci. Happy to criticize Fauci, blah, 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 blah. But Fauci in many ways does get a bad rap in this one sense, at least, which is that at the dawn of the pandemic, the head of the CDC, I can't even remember his name, did a really bad job. He was like, at one point he says, look, he was asked what this is going to be like. And he says, well, look, we don't know. It could be fine, or it could be really absolutely terrible. And it's like, okay, so it's like plan accordingly. Like, what can you do with that? Right. And Trump wasn't reassuring, and they needed someone out there. So they picked this guy who was like a major figure on infectious diseases from the 80s, who people remembered and thought was like a reassuring presence, who actually didn't have very much power in the chain of command other than sort of the bully pulpit stuff. And if Trump actually even if Trump just let Pence who he had put in charge of the thing, be Pence, it would have redounded to Trump's benefit. But he saw the ratings value in doing those daily press conferences, and he couldn't do it. And he let himself be controlled by Fauci. I think DeSantis is largely right about that. And I think Fauci, the stuff went to his head, and he started doing this "I am the science guy." But the whole reason Fauci became front and center was precisely because no one could play the role as a reassuring voice during a crisis. And the fact that the president of the United States can't be a reassuring voice during a crisis is a really terrible condemnation of a president.
Well, it sure is. And in this case, so incredibly avoidable, because I don't think that the bar was that high. Like not saying that you can pour bleach down your throat to get rid of it, not yelling at Acosta at CNN about ratings, like just eliminate a couple of those things. And I think he actually would have been fine. But here's why I know that what you're saying about the Fauci dynamic in those early stages was correct, and the blown opportunity that Trump had is Andrew Cuomo. I mean, the guy's not a likable guy, and he didn't do great things at all. He really screwed up badly. But for about 6 weeks, people loved him because he did sound like a grown-up. He had a certain seriousness and austerity that he brought to it, and he wasn't involved in the kind of just juvenile antics that Trump was early on. And so America was just looking for someone to kind of fill that void. And then, it dragged on so long. And I agree. I mean, I don't really have much positive to say about Fauci, but I think you're right in at least describing the early on stage of how that took hold. And now it was really Trump's to lose. In post 9/11, I guess you did have Giuliani kind of share the stage with Bush a little bit. But imagine if, like in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the only people we were hearing from, I don't mean like Rumsfeld or Condoleezza Rice, but I mean even lower than that, just pure government bureaucrats that we said, we want this guy who was like Paul Wolfowitz or somebody, like we want, here I go again with the Jews. What am I doing? We needed the top people to be the visible public face. And it was really comforting to the nation. And relying on an obscure government bureaucrat was, in hindsight, a terrible mistake, both in the politics, but also the policy of it.
Right. I mean, it ties back to what we were saying earlier about this natural desire to have someone be in charge. After a war, after an attack on the homeland or a pandemic, that's when that human desire becomes eminently reasonable. Is during a crisis, is you want someone to be sort of reassuring, we have this in hand. It may be hard, it may be tough, but you want a Zelensky type, right? You want someone who appeals to that sense of, if we all work together, we can fix this problem. My enduring problem about politics is the wanting to take that feeling during an actual crisis and make it a permanent modus vivendi of government. But that's a conversation we can do for another day. I know I've kept you a little long. I want to ask you bring up one last topic. I've gotten some pushback from people around here saying I talk too much about these fringe, new right movements like the post-liberal integralists and the new nationalists and all this kind of stuff. And maybe I do, but I think I've always been very clear. I care more about the health of conservatism than I care about the health of the Republican Party. And this is my lane. And I think it's an important thing to have arguments about. But so the question I have, which I've been struggling with, is I knew all about Brent Bozell, the elder, and his desire for sort of a Catholic sort of integral order and all that kind of stuff. But I read pretty deeply into conservatism for a very long time. And the actual word integralism, right, which is basically in Catholic doctrine, this idea that the state should essentially be subordinate to the church or the spirit of the church or the teachings of the church. And there are different versions of it in Portugal and Spain, and we don't have to get into all the weeds on that. I just didn't hear the word integralism until basically 2018 in any serious way. And So, like, first of all, I'm sort of the view that it's had its moment. I think that like the forthcoming Deneen book, which I've reviewed for our friends at the Acton Institute, is going to be sort of, if not the high water mark, then the sign that the water is receding on this movement. But in Protestantism, where is there a Protestant version of integralism? Is it basically Henry VIII creating a national church? I mean, what is it?
Well, so Jonah, this is the really, really hard part about the entire topic for me is I think that if there was a real serious intellectual, theological, philosophical yearning for reconciling competing truth claims in a pluralistic society, then I will be first in line to attend the discussion, to sponsor it, to host it, to bring all the serious heavyweights together, because I do not think that those of us who are outspoken defenders of a classical liberalism have had the last word on the complexity of what it means post-Enlightenment to have competing truth claims coexist in a peaceful society. And yet I'm perfectly comfortable with the Lockean liberal order as the framework in which I want Protestant political thought to exist. I do not agree that Drag Queen Story Hour is a great sign for democracy. And yet I do believe that the remedies for the things that we consider to be moral shortcomings in society and in community, that the remedy is more often than not the state. That stronger families, stronger schools, I'm a Yuval Levin guy through and through, mediating institutions and all that stuff. But there is, and we've talked about this before, I think the second time I was on your podcast, my late father was affiliated with this movement called Reconstructionist. And I do believe that if I work, and the post-millennialism that kind of started me being on your podcast, because it is called post-millennialism, not millenarianism, is an optimistic view that in the future, before the return of Christ, that all Christians believe is a future event, that I believe the world gets better, not worse, before he comes back. And a lot of people in Christendom don't believe that. They think it gets worse, and then he comes back to take us all out of this really bad world. Ironically, most of the people that have been most politically involved in your and mine's adult lifetime, the so-called moral majority, the Jerry Falwell, the good Jerry Falwell, the Christian right, these guys, all of them believe in what's called the premillennial eschatology, that things are going to get a lot worse. Yet along the way, they seem to start universities, get politically involved, start pro-life clinics, organize a really impressive effort of legal influence with Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and things. There's both Catholics and Protestants in that mix. But I happen to be a pretty engaged, culturally active, have a real vision for what I think culture should be like, and do so believing it's going to succeed someday. Maybe not in my lifetime, could be thousands of years, I don't know. But I believe that things will get better throughout history. So it's a different theology of history over time. But be that as it may, integralism can sound sometimes like a Catholic version of Protestant Reconstructionism, but there's a huge difference, is sphere sovereignty. What Abraham Kuyper and some of the great Dutch neo-Calvinists, they were all heirs of John Calvin, all heirs of the Protestant Reformation. But I fervently believe that there is a distinct sphere for the individual, for the family, for the church, and for the state, and that is perfectly consistent with the Constitution, perfectly consistent with a limited view of government. And it doesn't derive its authority or aspiration from papal authority. But do I think that in the type of society I'd like to live in, that I'd like you to live in, that I think you'd enjoy living in, that a local community could say, yeah, our city council voted, we're not going to have drag queen people rolling around on the floor with kids at our library. I think that would be perfectly acceptable. I'd like to see more local city councils not have Drag Queen Story Hour. But I want that change to come within the liberal order. So that's not integralism, right? That's just bottom up transformation, seeking to reconcile virtue and liberty together. I'm sorry for the long answer, but this is it's the most important topic. I don't really agree, Jonah, that they're fringe groups. Like, I think Sorab is very immature. I think that Deneen is a serious guy who's written 2 pretty bad books now, in my opinion. There's some of these integralists in Europe that have become more Twitter provocateurs than real thinkers. But like the NatCon thing at large, I think what Kevin Roberts is doing at Heritage, I think that's going to get institutionalized. I think that quote unquote skepticism about free markets and pretty soon a more explicit deplatforming of Ronald Reagan. I think it's coming, and maybe it's peaked in some of the provocation around it. But right now, the right has done such a poor job intellectually defending markets. They've depended so much on secular Randianism that claiming a Burkean and Buckleyite and Father Sirico and Michael Novak, reclaiming a view of markets that is tethered to virtue but is not integralist, that actually that is Yuval Levin, okay, basically. That's going to take us time and effort, but that's my vision for society, and I think that there's a lot in Protestant political history that believe in that. But unfortunately, there's always been, and there still are now, certain camps that grow impatient and that view, and that's sort of where this idea I'm kind of a DeSantis guy politically just because I'm such an anti-Trump guy. But like, I'm not comfortable with some of the stuff he's done with Disney. But the arguments from serious people, not Twitter people, within Team DeSantis on Disney is that the left has taken control of corporate boardrooms, and we have no choice but to kind of use some of those methodologies to fight back. That it's not good, but we're playing defense. And I'm not at all persuaded by the argument. I think that we, within the liberal order, can win this battle. But I don't think that philosophically, in other words, I always hate the word pluralism because I think most of the people that use it wrongly. I'm a structural pluralist. In Dave land, there will be people of different religions and different schools of thought, all freely exercising their own religion. But I still want, bottom up, a transformation of society to be more Christianized, to be more in the Judeo-Christian ethic, to admire liberty and virtue more. And so how do you get to that point when some people prize transgenderism and some people prize traditional family? There's a battle of ideas, and I want to win the battle of ideas. And this stuff is very, very messy, but I think the pure pluralist that talks as if we just simply have to go to our corner, it's really kind of an Anabaptist interpretation of Protestantism politically. I don't agree that we have to go surrender and just let everyone say what they're going to say and we'll just be one of the viewpoints. I think structurally we're one of the viewpoints, but culturally I'd like to be the prevailing one because I think we have truth on our side.
Well, we will definitely continue this conversation. I want to say my only clarification is that I think the integralist faction of this movement, I don't think is really going to go anywhere. The populists, the nationalists, the sort of illiberal types writ large, I think that's still a growing thing, and it concerns me greatly. But like, you're just not, when a huge part of the coalition that these people are appealing to are evangelical Protestants, Catholic integralism is just not going to win over that many people unless you water down what you mean by Catholic integralism to the point where it's not really integralism. It's just sort of old style remoralization and that kind of thing.
Well, because I'm within these Catholic and Protestant circles so heavily, I'll tell you another reason you're more right than you even know. It's this Pope. Right now, Catholic integralists can't say, hey, all of these years of secular political philosophy have gotten us nowhere. We need the church to assert more power. I turn to you, Pope Francis, because they're all mad at him. And I think if they had Pope John Paul the Great, or if they had Benedict, that people would at least look at it like, oh yeah, we kind of like what they're doing. But right now, I don't think integralism is ready to make its own argument very well.
Right. That's a good point. All right, my friend, we went long, but I don't care. Always great to have you here. And obviously you'll be back.
Thanks so much, Jonah. Loved it.